Author and journalist Michelle Sherburne has been researching the Underground Railroad and the Civil War for 20 years, lecturing at schools, organizations, and conferences. She sat down and talked with us about what it takes to write about history. It's very much different way of writing, but Michelle reinforces the idea that passion and curiosity are the cornerstones of any creative endeavor. If you are a seasoned writer or even new to writing or even a fan of New England history, you will enjoy hearing what Michelle has to say. So we're here. So this is episode 9 of Storycomic Presents, and I have with me I always say in the studio because I don't know how else to say it, but through the magic of the internet, we're talking with me is Michelle Sherburne. She is a famed Vermont author and historian. You can't go to any bookstore without bumping into one of Michelle Sherburne's books. And for those that are familiar with Michelle, she's been researching the Underground Railroad. She's been researching Civil War, Vermont and Northern New England Civil War things, New Hampshire and Vermont, for knocking on 30 years right now.
Yeah, that's right.
That's about, yeah, okay.
That's right. We'll do the math.
So as I was saying, I was telling Michelle before we went live that I got a nice big old list of notes and questions for her, but what I wanted to do first was kind of introduce you to the listeners and the viewers and tell people a little bit about yourself.
Okay, not a problem. Thanks for having me, Josh. This is an experience, so this is great. Yes, I've been a historian for that long. Yep, three decades. I've been in the newspaper business for that long. I was born in Pennsylvania, moved up to Vermont in 1976, and I got into writing in high school. And here's a shout out to Blue Mountain Union High School, where I graduated in 1984, and started working at a newspaper 2 days after high school graduation. And so I learned the ropes of the newspaper business in a weekly, Journal Opinion in Bradford, and started writing. I think my first newspaper article was published when I was a junior in high school. So I've been writing for a very long time. Just a little family background. My father's Jim Arnowski. He's a famous nationwide children's book author, illustrator. And so I've been around the publishing field for my whole life. So I worked in the newspaper business, production, editing, the whole gamut. But on the side, always writing articles. And I kind of fell into writing history articles. And that's kind of how I got into researching.
So tell me about it, because right now you have 4 books that you've written so far. The first one was in 2012. It was basically a historical book based off of the Peachum and during the Civil War, and that seemed to have launched you into writing more and more books about the Civil War. You have the abolition in the Underground Railroad in Vermont, which then kind of turned into, you also wrote the St. Albans Raid, and then your most recent book was about the Underground Railroad in New Hampshire. So you were working a lot in doing research about the Civil War. What kind of, and as you mentioned earlier, that kind of started from that. When did it become that level of that passion of deciding to say, you know what, I can write some books about this?
Well, actually, I'd been working on manuscripts for books for years, way before the Peachum connection. I had researched the Underground Railroad for about 25 years. So I kept running into stories that were about people who were really fascinating in Vermont, and I wanted to share it. But I really didn't have a voice. I really didn't know how to make it interesting. And what got me into the Underground Railroad was actually a newspaper assignment. I was given a feature article. Hey, here's a place in Haverhill, New Hampshire that has a Underground Railroad safe house. Go do a fluff piece. And that's really what started it. And I ended up doing like a 3-month research project for the Caledonian Record in St. Johnsbury, and ended up with a three-page series in their paper because of the work I did. So when I started researching the Underground Railroad, it just was like dominoes. You just kept you just kept bumping into more and more information and more interesting stories, and I just wanted to tell them. So I've been working on something for a very long time. The Peachum connection worked well because I volunteered my time. I got into that because my husband's grandfather was a Peachum native, Herman Clark, and he had an ancestor who had been in the Civil War and had been at Andersonville Prison and wrote about it. So I got connected with Peachum Historical Association and volunteered my time. That's how that Peachum book came about, was working with them. And what it did was it gave me credibility because I didn't have any historic background as far as, the general public or academia would see it.
So you wrote, your first book was the Vermont Hill Town in the Civil War. That was the title of it, right?
Yes, that was actually, I edited that book.
Okay.
I worked with the president of Peachum Historical Association, and we worked for 2 years compiling all that we could about Peachum soldiers. And I learned a lot because I did a lot of transcription of diaries, memoirs, letters, and I got an education in the Civil War. I didn't have any background in the Civil War. That was all new. So that kind of gave me some credibility, and then that Peachum book became an award-winning book that people, really enjoyed, and it kind of launched me into being able to work on my own books. But the first book I did on the Underground Railroad in Vermont took 22 years to find a home. Persistence, people, persistence. Don't give up.
So that book came out in 2013. When did you actually finish writing it then? How long, what was the period between finishing writing it and then actually finding a publisher to get it printed?
Well, I do things a little backwards. So I had rough drafts, but I basically was pitching a number of publishers with a concept and not a finished manuscript.
Okay,
that's backwards. So basically when, the commissioning editor said, yes, the board wants this book and here's the deadline, I was faced with, okay, I got to write this. And that's how it's been. I did not sell a completed manuscript. But I work well under pressure because of my newspaper training.
Okay. So yeah, that's kind of interesting. What did you do? So you pitched the book. Did they tell you it has to be X amount of pages, or how did that work?
Yeah, the History Press, which is now owned by Arcadia, they have formulas that they tell you. They give you a word count, a picture count. They tell you that, and you're supposed to stay within that. And it was very difficult because 22 years of research is files and files and files. And I had to winnow it down to very short chapters and just touch on certain things. And it was a difficult job. But I was really pleased with how it came out. I mean, the message came across. Something else about finding my voice. A lot of the reason I did find my writing voice was because some friends of mine asked me to do a history presentation, and they coached me. Jackie and Peter Sinclair in Reigate coached me, and I started doing presentations. And you found very quickly what's interesting to people and what's not. And so that's when I kind of figured out, oh, I can do this. I can write this in the right form. I've been writing for years. It just wasn't that good.
I had one of my friends always said that it's impossible to get worse at something that you do every day. So.
Well, and as being a writer, you're always writing mentally. You're always jotting down notes. You always have a number of things playing in your head, projects. That's how I am. But when you do historic writing, historical books, it's facts. These are not stories that I'm making up and I can't elaborate on. So it's very different. You have to do the research. And what I find interesting is that everything in history is like a mystery. You usually just get little bits and pieces of facts, and especially in the Underground Railroad, that's a huge problem with it, is that you get just a little tiny piece of evidence. And what your job is as a historian first is to just find as many clues and as much information to solve a mystery. And that's why it's so interesting. That's why I love it so much. I'll research anything. I have small research projects all the time because someone will say something, hey, did you know about this? And then you start digging and you find a great story. So it's, so that's where, that's why I like history, because of that, because there's the mystery aspect to it. And with this subject, there's an awful lot of excavating that has to go on. So it's a lot of research and you have to be very persistent. I spent a whole year tracking down a man from the 1800s just to figure out what his full name was and also what his story, what his background was. Where'd he come from? He just popped up in Topsham, Vermont, and I didn't know who he was, and he was a player in the Underground Railroad, and it took me a year every night Googling. And I found it. I found Nathan. I found him.
It's
addictive.
Yeah. That's interesting. You bring that up because it's, talking to some other writers that write science fiction or fantasy, is writing fiction in that sense seems to me be more of an additive art, meaning that you add more to it to tell more of a story. Right. Or what you're talking about is almost like editing a documentary where you have to subtract, you're like trimming out some things. And
yes.
Have you ever been in a position where because of being as a writer, do you ever get in those positions where you're just tempted to make links, like speculate, like you can't put put speculation in some of your stuff? Or
I've been very careful not to do that, because when I started out with this subject, it was not the Underground Railroad, Vermont, New Hampshire, all of that was considered a whole bunch of folklore. It wasn't considered history. And I spent a lot of time telling people, yes, it was. This happened here. There were slaves being hidden. There were slaves owned in New Hampshire. And I had experts. I had historical societies telling me, no, it wasn't. And so for me to make anything up, I couldn't. for years I wanted to do a fictional novel on it, but I couldn't because I needed to be taken seriously. And it's taken me this long to be taken seriously. But you have to be very careful. The other thing about writing about history is you have to have all your facts and research in front of you so you're accurate and quoting precise. You can't do it. I'm going to just paraphrase. You have to make sure that the quote that President Abraham Lincoln, that quote is verbatim. Here you go. So it's tricky. It really is, but it has to be accurate. Sorry.
Do you think by the fact that you're published and not say self-published adds a little bit more from your perspective as a writer of history, it adds a more legitimacy to it than say if you self-published your own books?
I think it helps that I have a publisher. I think you're right. I agree with that because especially with the subject matter. Civil War, if I wrote just about the Civil War, I probably could have self-published and been taken seriously, but the Underground Railroad's a tricky subject, and so I've treaded very carefully. Also, I wanted to have a publisher. There have been so many doors opened up to me because I have a national publisher. My book is available all around the world in different languages, and it's opened up opportunities, television, being a part of being a historian in schools, just different connections. So, so that's why I went with that, with a national publisher.
And you just mentioned before, because you just recently you were a guest on the Ghost Brothers show on the Travel Channel.
Yeah.
And what was that about?
So, I'll do the lead in, how the door opened, and then I'll tell you about the show. How's that?
Sure.
So the executive producer of this Ghost Brothers show, he's out in California, and they were going to come to Hillsborough, New Hampshire, to investigate a bed and breakfast that is haunted. And so one of the stories about this bed and breakfast was that a young runaway slave boy had died and was buried in the basement and was haunting the place. And so he started searching, is there any possibility the Underground Railroad had networks going up through New Hampshire? So he Googled it, and he came across my New Hampshire book. And he contacted my publisher, and I get an email from my publicist saying, hey, this guy wants to talk to you. Here's his email. Connect if you want. So I connected, and he said, look, this is what I'm doing. We're doing a paranormal investigation of this place. So that's the kind of door it opened. I gave him information. I said, yes, it's possible. I've researched it. I know that it's possible that runaways were being brought up past that town. I'm not specific to that place. So I ended up, being asked to be on the show as a guest. So, and the show is called Haunted House Guests. And there's actually 3 spirits that are haunting this bed and breakfast. And it's very interesting. And these guys go there and bring their equipment and like Ghostbusters. and they go in, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to figure out why a spirit is in the house, and what they want. And it was all very, on the level. It was all, nothing scary, but it was interesting. And, and I was able to share about the Underground Railroad going up through New Hampshire. So, and free publicity, So that's the kind of doors it opens.
Right.
Yeah.
And your books you did in the Underground Railroad, you also did a book that got a lot of press over when it came out in 2014, and people are still talking about it. Is your book about the St. Albans Raid? So how did you did your research on the Underground Railroad and the Civil War era in Vermont,
Mhm.
and were you explicit in learning more about the St. Albans Raid, or did you stumble upon that and that just became a seed in your head? You're like, I need to learn more about this. How was your book created?
Well, that was also that was a good pitch. It's a great sales pitch. I had just finished the Vermont book, like you said, and I wanted to get on the list, the publishing list for the next, for the next year. And I pitched a couple ideas, Vermont related. I'd heard of the St. Albans Raid, honestly didn't know much about it, hadn't researched it, hadn't come up in my, in front of me. I basically just, I thought about it and went, you know what, that might be a good idea. So I pitched it to the publisher. And they said, that sounds awesome. I said, yeah, this is great. It's the 150th anniversary in, 2014. In 2014. It was the 150th anniversary of the actual event. And they were like, that's great. So we want the book ready for the event. So, so get this, I'm not kidding. I pitched it in March. They gave me the go-ahead the beginning of April. They wanted the book completely done by July 1st.
Wow.
That because the anniversary was in September. So they wanted the book to go into production and be premiered the week of the September anniversary. That meant that I had to research and write from April to July 1st. And I did it. I stayed married and I didn't lose my job. It was insane. It was insane. The other thing about the St. Albans Raid was I didn't know anybody in St. Albans. I just started making phone calls. And I attached myself to the museum, the St. Albans Historical Museum, and I said, I'd like to do a book. Would you please help me? And they were so gracious to open their doors and their arms. And I sat down with a 92-year-old St. Albans native who told me, laid out the politics of the time, and he's a benefactor of the museum, and he knew a lot. They helped me so much. So I basically, in 3 months, researched. I mean, I was on Google grabbing everything I could, reading old text to create this book. And it wasn't just a small story. I did all aspects of it. How did Vermonters respond to this raid? And I learned in the process that Vermont went into a virtual lockdown for 3 months after the raid because they thought Canada was attacking them and they thought it was going to happen again. I researched the soldiers who were in the Civil War on the war front, writing home going, hey, I heard about the raid. Are you okay, Mom? So it was quite a story. And I learned it's just fascinating, all the people up there. So, and then it made me the most current expert on the raid. So every time they need something, they call me. So they're great. They really are great, the museum.
So just give a quick synopsis for the folks that are unfamiliar with the St. Albans Raid. So it was basically Confederate soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
Was it 6 or 8 of them?
So I'll give you this. I'll give you the synopsis so we're accurate.
Okay.
So this was in October 1864. So we're almost at the end of the Civil War. And what it was an undercover operation by Confederates that were hiding out in Canada. President Jefferson Davis had sent a whole bunch of Confederates to Canada, and they were trying to come up with secret missions to undermine Lincoln and to infiltrate in the north. So what they decided, one of the things they were going to do was they were going to do raids. So this was all commissioned by Davis, and it was 21 men.
Wow.
That infiltrated St. Albans, but they infiltrated the community. They didn't ride in on horseback, waving a flag in uniform. They showed up a couple weeks earlier and stayed in the hotels and pretended to be tourists. And they mixed with the locals, and they they did reconnaissance missions. What's going to be the best thing? They picked a certain day, October 19th, 1864, and they stationed themselves around the town, the green, the park, which is Taylor Park now. They basically blocked it off, and at a quiet time of day, and they took over the town.
Huh.
It was a 30-minute raid, and part of the raid was to take hostage anybody that was on Main Street, and they raided 3 banks. They robbed 3 banks at the same time, and they stole about, in today's money, $200,000.
Wow.
And they took over they threatened people, they took hostages, and once the bank robberies were completed, they stole horses because they didn't come in on horseback. They tried to burn down the town, but it didn't work. The reason it didn't work was that you familiar with Greek fire?
No.
Do you know what Greek fire is? So it's a very old, it's an ancient mixture that is flammable, and it's like phosphorus and sulfur mixed together. The problem with it is that if you add water to it, it increases the flame. It doesn't put it out, and you don't need to light it. So what they had were bottles of Greek fire that they tried smashing against buildings to try to set things on fire, but because it was a rainy day, the water didn't work right, and it didn't work. They didn't burn anything. Anyway, the whole point was 30-minute raid, and they took off to Canada, only like 20 minutes away, and they thought they were home free, but they didn't realize that almost 100 St. Albans men got angry and chased after them and arrested them in Canada.
Oh, wow.
So it was a failed attempt, but it did scare everybody in Vermont. It's a great story. And these were soldiers, but they actually went on trial as robbers, as thieves, and they were acquitted. But it's just a great story. And St. Albans, celebrates all of that. So it's fascinating all the way around. And I like to do reenactments of the raid when I go to schools.
Oh, really?
Yeah, bank robberies with fake money. Stealing horses, taking posses after them. Kids love it. Kids love it. I mean, it's the best thing. And what it does is, that's something that's important to me, is that with my books, I like to inspire people to start digging themselves. And I like to introduce history to people who would never think that it was interesting. So that's one of my missions in writing, but that's my synopsis of the St. Albans Raid.
Well, you also were interviewed by Mysteries at the Museum, another show, and that was based off the St. Albans Raid.
Yes. It was boy, that's in syndication, and that's great. I get comments all the time, friends, family, that say, hey, I saw you the other night. I have kids that come up to me and go, hey, I saw you on TV. That was a great one. It was a scary experience because it was like a police interrogation. Dark room, spotlight, cameraman's 3 feet away from you. I can't move because the sound man says I can hear you. And the producers sat on the floor 3 feet away asking me to say the same thing in 3 different sound bites. And it was all off the top of my head. Say that again with this inflection. Where's the script? No, But it came off really good, and they did a really nice job with it. Some of it was a little inaccurate when they did the actor portrayal thing, but
Right.
they didn't ask me that. But the funny thing is that the producer of the show called the St. Albans Museum, called the director, Alex Leidnig, and said, hey, we would like to do a Mysteries at the Museum show. And he laughed at her and said, that's a funny joke, and hung up on her. He thought somebody was playing a prank. So she called again and said, no, seriously, I'm with the Travel Channel show, Mysteries at the Museum, and we really do want to come to St. Albans. And he went, oh, I'm sorry. And then the next phone call was to me. He says, they want to come here. Would you do it?
Talk to us a bit about your writing. So when you do, when you go and you talk to students, do you see yourself more or less promoting being a writer or promoting the history part of it?
I would say with kids, you're pushing the history part, because when I talk to them, I try to instill in them that history happened here. It didn't happen all in New York City and Philadelphia and Boston. That history happened right here, and the monuments that you go by each day actually are for something real. And there's some pretty fascinating things that happened right in your own little town. And so I really don't push the writing part, because with kids, so many of them don't like history. Mm-hmm. And, I'm dealing with maybe, I'd say from 4th grade up to 12th. So when I've been a historian in residence at a school, I want to get kids interested in history and say, this is really cool. Let me tell you about this person. They really lived here, and that house. It's right around the corner, that kind of stuff. As far as the writing, that's more for adults. I have a lot of people who will ask me about writing, and I advise people all the time. If you like to write, just write anything. If you're interested in something, that's the best thing. Write the best thing you can about it. If you want to write history, research it and then tell the story. And a lot of times in writing, people are like, well, I don't know how to start, and I don't know how to do this. And I always say the same thing. You never, as far as I'm concerned, you never start at page 1, chapter 1, page 1, and write through to the end of the book. That's not how it works with me. I basically take chunks. I will write in chunks, whatever is coming to mind. I'm going to cover this, A, B, C, and D. And I just get it on paper. And the beauty of computers is you can copy and paste and move things around. But I never, you never start at the beginning, because the blank page will stare at you for a very long time. So basically, if you have a story to tell, sometimes I say, just take a tape recorder and tape yourself. Tell the story verbally, and then type it out, and then you go back through, and your job as a writer is to mold it into a finished product. So that's what I tell people that ask about writing, and that's usually adults.
And when you write historical books, when you mentioned before that Arcadia Publishing, did they give you an outline to say you need to make sure that it's either like in chronological order, or do you have to start off with a question and then kind of build up some suspense? Or how would you define the style of the books, the historical books that you put together?
They kind of left that all up to me.
Okay.
The first book I did, because I had such a wealth of information, I had to pick and choose but I also had a really good editor, and it was nice because I could send her stuff and she'd read a chapter and go, yeah, no, you covered that in the first paragraph. I don't need 3 pages on it. And she was really, really good. And I learned that first time that this is the structure that I should do for them. And it's very limited. The chapters have to be short, and because their readers aren't, history nerds like me who want to read every little bit, and you read the bibliography at the back as like it's interesting. So they didn't give me any guidelines. The Raid book fell in, sometimes they just fall in place. A lot of times I contribute a lot of my history books falling in place because of newspaper writing. I've done it for 30 years. I've written articles, and you go to a meeting, you go and you interview somebody, and you have to figure out how to take this interview and make it an interesting article. And you always have to cover the basics: who, what, where, when, why, how. And that's what the mystery part is. So in writing, it's the same thing. And a lot of the reason I can do that is because of the background I have. That's a lot. Newspaper writing is very precise.
And do you feel as though that your background in journalism kind of prepared you to do that investigative level of historical research?
I think it helps me organize when I write, because a lot of, I spent years writing feature articles about people who make rugs and or wood carvers, human interest stories. But it's basically the same thing. You're telling readers a story about this person and why they're interesting. And I try to do that with history. My subject of the Underground Railroad falls under a misconception category a lot. And one of the misconceptions is that it's all about the house. And it's not. Everybody will, I don't know how many, I have done hundreds and hundreds of presentations. So I've met a lot of people. I've been doing it since 2011. It's a while. And they all say the same thing. They come up afterwards and they're like, so I grew up in a house that had a closet with a half a door and then a stairs that went into the rabbit hole, that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm very polite about it, but I'm like, who lived there? The house didn't do anything. Who lived there?
Right.
So it's the same thing. My newspaper background got me into the people interest. And that's what I try to bring to in the writing of history, is that, these are real people. They're real people. So that's what's neat about it. And that's why I got to share it.
So that's interesting. It's almost like you take on because of your journalism background, it seems as though that when you do this historical investigations and put these books together, you focus more on the people instead of the actual places. It's almost the people are the story, not the actual, not physical locations.
Right. Like historical marker stuff.
Right.
Right. Yeah. No, I try to focus on the people because I try to figure out how they risked their reputations, how they risked their social network to help strangers. Because the bottom line is that's what the Underground Railroad was. It was a network of strangers helping runaway strangers, and you risked everything doing it. It wasn't something gallant that you advertised because it was illegal. So that to me, they were already heroes just knowing that they helped. So my job is to find out all about them. What did they do in town? What did they do for work? What group? What church did they go to? What build a sociogram around them. And a lot of times that you never even pick up anything that says he was an Underground Railroad agent or something. So it is about the people. You're right. And that's what I try to stress is I always start off my talks like that. I want to introduce you guys to a lot of great people. I mean, right? Because that's what it's about.
Right.
Yeah. It's
And
pretty fascinating.
Do you feel yourself as, do you kind of define yourself as an historian that writes, or do you consider yourself a writer who loves history?
I think I've evolved into a historian who writes. I've always been a writer, always have. But I think that because I got into this groove of researching, to me, it's just important to learn this whole story, figure out the mystery.
Right.
I really would like to get into historical fiction so that I could stretch my wings, because it's really hard to stay in the parameters of historic, actual factual.
Right.
It's hard.
So, almost, do you have a parallel when with how other writers have ideas? They have like an idea Bible where they're like, all right, that's a story I'm going to tell one day, like whatever it be. Do you have kind of a similar stack where you were talking earlier, where you're going down a trail and you're finding something, and then you hit a dead end because you can't find that next thing to connect that dot to something else? Do you have other stories that you're eager to put down and tell that are historical that you just had to put to the side because you couldn't find the right information?
It's more that I can't find the time to do them. I have full, I mean, I've researched as far as staying on the historic, writing historical books. I have so many research projects that I've done that I have figured out the mystery. I have ended the story. I have to work full time. Mm-hmm. And so I don't have the time to actually devote to just writing. And I have so many, like you said, there's like files in my brain. Mm. I'd love to do this. I'd love to do that. Right. And I've researched, I know that I haven't put out a book in the last couple of years. And a lot of that is because the projects I've been working on are not really for books. Mm. Okay. They're research projects that will become articles, or they'll become short stories, or I've been on a couple, some really interesting mysteries, photographic mysteries, tracking down. I spent probably a year tracking down a photographer in the early 1900s who had a studio in White River Junction. And I tracked it down because a friend of mine had bought negatives that had no ID. So I started with a stack of images trying to figure out where the pictures were taken.
Oh, wow.
It's a great mystery. And then I started to figure out, I mean, who took these pictures? That was the mystery. Who took these great pictures? Because they're so awesome. And then I started picking out, oh, wait, that place is in Thetford. Wait, that place is in Lyme, New Hampshire. And it turns out I figured out who the photographer was. He grew up in Lyme, New Hampshire. And then I found out all about him. I dug out and people don't even know about his life. He ended up taking thousands of photos of the Upper Valley in Vermont and New Hampshire. That these negatives are at Dartmouth College in the special collections. Thousands of pictures that are used because he took pictures of streets and buildings and factories in the early 1900s, creating a footprint of what it looked like in that time frame. And nobody knew who he was until I figured out who he was. Oh, wow. George Fellows. All these pictures all over the place are his, and and there's no copyright and no credit. But his story was pretty fascinating, and that was that was a rabbit trail.
Wow.
It's a great story. And I went down to White River to have a meeting I was doing an interview down there at Eris Solutions in White River. I'm standing in the window and I went, oh my gosh, this was George Fellows's photography studio, this window I'm looking out of. I went home and I checked the photos. I checked where I knew his photography, and I was there at the window of his studio. I mean, okay, that's one of those history geek things. That's so cool. Yeah.
Do you have you? And now that you're a published, you've been for close to a decade now a published Vermont author. What kind of linkage do you have with other Vermont authors? Is there a network that you're a part of that you guys talk in, or how does that work?
Well, I have a lot of connections with historical society people, because of the research and because you run into them, Civil War, fanatics. I have a lot of connections there. As far as other writers, I pretty much go solo just because it's a time thing. But I started going to Bookstock, which is a huge book festival in Woodstock, Vermont. 3-day event, and I started going like 4 years ago. And they showcase Vermont writers and independent publishers, and I saw you there. So that's when I started to connect with people, in the area and reach out to different people through that Bookstock, because you're dealing with other people like you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and not necessarily just Vermont either.
Right.
More like New England. But I really am not one of those people. I don't do writers groups, and I just don't.
Right.
Because my father always said, if you have something you want to write about, don't tell anybody, don't talk about it.
Right.
Get it on paper, because if you tell it flees. Not that somebody's going to take it, it's just that it's gone.
Right.
And so you need to share, you have to focus your passion on paper.
Right.
That's
Because
why usually,
Yeah. I'm just curious to wonder if like mystery writers always are a different ilk than, say, like fantasy writers, or as you say, like historical writers. And I'm wondering what the skill sets would be for different, like, I'm curious to know if there's people that write write history books that then will write, like you're saying, like a historical mystery or a historical fiction book. Or I'm wondering where the overlap is, or if it's all basically, Interstate 91 and Route 5. They just don't really connect.
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I've talked to other writers. I met this really fascinating woman down, there was an author's night in Keene, New Hampshire, and I met this romance novelist, and she's from Keene. And it was really fascinating to listen to her do her presentation and meet her and, get a sense of how she writes. And, she was like, well, this is my job. I get up in the morning, I go and I write from 8 to 5, and this is my job. Because I was like, how do you put out so many books so fast? And she's like, because 40 hours a week. I'm so jealous. But it was interesting. And I understand that you do learn a lot from other people. The history part, I talk to a lot of people because I research. So you're dealing with specialists and things, professors and, but as far as the writing, I wish I could, but it's self-isolation,
Right. And do you have, so we're close to an hour already. Wow.
Oh, cool. I told you it wouldn't be hard.
Yeah. So if there's writers out there who are looking at, that have taken a pretty strong interest in writing something historical, grabbing their passion of whatever it might be, whether it be, any historical event. And what would be the advice that you would give to future writers that you wish you knew about before you started writing?
Well, I think that you have to know how to have to know how to sell the idea. It has to be interesting, and if you're going to do books about history, like I said earlier, it has to be accurate. So you have to make sure that you are quoting everybody properly, that you're tagging everything properly, because you don't want people will catch you on it. I think it's you just have to be thorough, and I think that I would like to get into a larger writing format, so that you could have all your information. The research is out there. I think it's easy to research. You just have to know how to ask the questions. So if you are researching for a specific book subject, ask all the questions. So much is online. It's so easy now. When I started researching this, I had to go to libraries and go to town offices to read town histories. It wasn't online. So I mean, now everything you can read text from the 1800s. So use all your sources. And it is good to read see how other people do it. Read other historic books and see how do you like that? Is that too dry? Is that, okay, that's way too much fact. But my bottom line for anybody who wants to write is just start putting down words on paper. Don't think that it starts at the beginning. I've never written a newspaper article, covering a town meeting. I've never started at the beginning. You never do. You always figure out how to what's your lead, what's going to be your grabber. But if you sat there and worried about, how am I going to start this, you're not going to do it. And nothing is ever perfect.
So who do you recommend? You mentioned that. What authors inspired you as you were writing?
Well, I like with history, it's a little tricky, but I would go to the fiction authors that I like. Dick Francis, who wrote all kinds of history, not history, mystery novels about the racing in England. He could write very concise, even though it was fiction. And I'm learning a lot. I'm a very big Outlander fan, and Diana Gabaldon is like the best in research and in writing, and so I learn from that. I learn, even though that's all a lot of it's fiction, she's done her homework. And that's the key, is when you're going to do history, you have to do your homework. You have to be able to back it up. But a lot of them, the writers that I like, are usually like mystery or history. It all just goes together.
So Michelle, where can people find your work, your works right now?
The Peachum Civil War book is available online. You can just go to the Peachum Historical Association website. I don't think that's that's not in like an Amazon deal, but the History Press books are all available online. You just type in my name, and it's available on all of the big websites. That's the nice part about it. And it's also in like the Phoenix books around Vermont. But it's easily found online.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I do, I have written a lot for the newspaper I work at the Journal Opinion, and so that's also archived through the Department of Libraries and stuff. So that's another thing that, like you said, the files. I have a 10-part series I wrote for the Journal Opinion. It took 2 years to write.
Wow.
It would be nice to be a book. I'm just not sure, but it's about an unsolved Vermont murder case.
Oh, wow.
And so I'd like to maybe do a book on that, but I don't know. It's tricky because it's a controversial issue, but stuff like that. I researched that, and the interesting thing was you researched like the past because it happened in the 1950s, but then you still have people that are in the present. So then I used my newspaper background to interview people today. So you got the past and the present, which is really an interesting parallel in one subject.
Right.
So
wow.
that was good. I did the series, and I interviewed for 2 years, interviewed family members and people who were around in the 50s. And then I ended up doing a large presentation on it last year. Mm-hmm. It's all research. It's all history.
Right.
It'd be nice to have it in a book, but.
Yeah, if it's already written out, right? You already have it as a 10-part series, just putting it.
I know.
Pilot. So technically it's already published. Now you just need to put it between two book covers. So
I know.
Right.
Yeah. I like that marketing, when I don't have to do it.
Well, this was great, Michelle. I think that a lot of people that are interested in writing or interested in history, there is a way to be able to sit down and put it down. And as you said, I think that the most important part is that you follow your passion, find something that you're really passionate about, and write about it.
And I think I agree, Josh. And I think that a lot of people that I've met, they already have interests and passions. They just don't know how to move to the next level.
Right.
And part of the nice thing about my work is that it has different levels. With the presentations I give, I get to share more information than what I could put in books. And I tell people all the time, go home and Google it. Go home and look it up. Start digging. If you have, your grandmother saved letters from, the Civil War, I said, dig them out and do the homework, because you may have a treasure right in your hands and you don't know it.
Right. Yeah.
And that's a big deal. And I try to push that. I try to get people to do that. And if you write, then write about it.
Right.
So yeah. I definitely promote that.
Well,
and I was gonna one of the things that I look to is it's important for me to look at history, and make it interesting, but because it's important to know where we came from, so we know where we're going.
Right.
And I like to just share, and that's why, the stories are not good if they just sit on a dusty shelf.
Right.
So that's why I like digging them up.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you very much, Michelle. And
awesome.
We'll look forward to seeing what your next book is going to be. And like we say, people can see your books online. The St. Albans Raid, the Underground Railroad in Vermont, the Underground Railroad in New Hampshire, the Vermont Hilltown in the Civil War, the book about Peachum. And they can find you anywhere at the Journal Opinion is online, and subscribe to your local newspapers, everybody. So.
But I think the Mysteries at the Museum show I did was more like a police interrogation, and that was scary. And so they go around visiting all these different museums. So that was an interrogation where it was like a dark room with a spotlight and,
Oh,
you
really?
know, drilling you with questions, and I couldn't move.
Oh,
So
wow.
it was really scary.